At a few seconds before 3 o'clock in the afternoon, local time, on the 18th of December 2022, a Boeing 777 in the blue and white livery of United Airlines broke through a layer of heavy cloud over the Pacific Ocean, a few miles north of the Hawaiian island of Maui, and the passengers on the right-hand side of the cabin, looking out of their windows, saw the surface of the water directly ahead of them. Not below the wing, ahead. The aircraft was no longer climbing. It was diving toward the sea at more than 8,500 feet per minute, and the people on board had perhaps 10 seconds left. The flight number was United Airlines 1722, en route from Kahului Airport to San Francisco, with 271 passengers and 10 crew on board. It had departed the runway 1 minute and 20 seconds earlier. By the time the captain pulled the aircraft out of the dive, 748 feet above the Pacific, at nearly 2 7/10 times the standard force of gravity, the entire incident had lasted under a minute. No one was injured. The aircraft was not damaged. The flight continued to San Francisco, landed without further incident, and the captain filed a routine internal report. For the next 2 months, no one outside the airline knew that anything had happened at all. The morning of the 18th had been turbulent over the Hawaiian Islands, long before Flight 1722 ever pushed back from its gate. Several hours earlier, on its final approach into Honolulu from Phoenix, a Hawaiian Airlines Airbus A330 had flown into severe clear air turbulence so violent that 36 people on board had required medical attention after landing. 11 of them, including a 1-year-old child and 3 crew members, were classified as seriously injured. The airframe had absorbed the violence, and the aircraft had reached the ground intact, but the cabin had been shaken so hard that unsecured passengers had been thrown against the ceiling. The incident had occurred near Maui, the same island from which United 1722 was now scheduled to depart. And the news of it was, by mid-afternoon, circulating among pilots in the area. The first officer of 1722 received the news by text message from a friend while he was conducting the pre-flight walk-around in the heavy rain outside the aircraft. He read the message, replied to thank his friend, and turned off his phone before boarding. Inside the cockpit, he passed the information to the captain, who incorporated it into the briefing he had already given to the lead cabin attendant, telling her, as a precaution, that the cabin crew should remain in their seats throughout the initial climb rather than beginning service. The captain was 55 years old, with 19,600 flight hours behind him and type ratings on a wide range of aircraft. He had 5,000 of those hours on the Boeing 777 specifically, though only 300 of them as the pilot in command. Beside him sat the first officer, around 5,300 hours into his own career, most of them earned at his previous airline on a different aircraft type, with only 120 hours logged on the 777. He was new to the aircraft, new to the airline, and on this flight, he was the pilot monitoring, while the captain was the pilot flying. The weather at Kahului was poor. Visibility was reduced by heavy rain, and the tower had been issuing advisories for low-level wind shear all afternoon, a phenomenon in which the wind changes direction or speed sharply within a few hundred feet of the surface, capable of producing sudden losses of airspeed on aircraft climbing out from the runway. The pilots, working through their performance calculations, consulted the airline's computer-based takeoff planning system and were given a recommended configuration of flaps 20 with reduced thrust for the runway then in use. While they were taxiing, however, the tower informed them that the active runway had been changed. The pilots reassessed the situation. With other crews reporting significant low-level wind shear in the area, they decided to increase their margin. Same flap setting at 20 degrees, but with maximum thrust rather than the reduced setting the system had recommended. The principle was straightforward. In unstable air close to the ground, more engine power gives the aircraft more options. At 14:49 local time, the aircraft was cleared for takeoff. With the windshield wipers running at full speed and the weather radar showing storm cells in every direction, the Boeing accelerated down the runway, rotated normally, and began its climb into the cloud layer at full thrust. The first officer retracted the landing gear. The aircraft entered the cloud at around 1,400 feet, and the first officer checked in with Honolulu Departure Control, who cleared them to climb to 16,000 feet and approved any weather deviations they might need to make. So far, everything was normal. The aircraft was climbing steadily, the auto-throttle was managing the engines, and the captain was beginning the standard procedure for cleaning up the aircraft as it accelerated through the climb. At the point where the procedure called for the flap setting to be reduced, the captain said the word, "Flaps 5," and the first officer reached down to the flap selector and moved it. He did not move it to 5, he moved it to 15. The difference between the two settings is significant. Flaps 5 is the configuration for the early climb, with most of the high lift devices on the wing already retracted into the airframe. Flaps 15 is closer to takeoff configuration, with the surfaces still extended deep into the airflow. At the speed the aircraft was now reaching, Flaps 15 would soon be beyond the maximum permitted setting for that airspeed, and the aircraft would begin to register an overspeed condition on the flap system. What the captain saw on his airspeed indicator a few seconds later was the speed climbing more rapidly than he would have expected, and the maximum allowable speed marker on the display moving downward toward the actual airspeed. Both indications were pointing toward an imminent flap overspeed, the kind of event that, if allowed to develop, could damage the flap mechanism or stress the wing structure itself. He reached for the auto-throttle and reduced the thrust manually. The engines spooled back, and the aircraft's nose pitched slightly downward in response to the reduction in power, though it was still climbing. At this moment, the captain's attention turned to the flaps themselves. In his mind, the setting should have been 5, because that was what he had called for. He began to scan the cockpit displays for any sign that a flap malfunction was occurring. No chime had sounded, no caution message had appeared, but the speed was still rising as though the flaps were not where they should be, and he could not immediately reconcile what the instruments were telling him. A few seconds later, he understood. The flaps were at 15, not at 5. He called for flaps 5 again, twice, and turned to look at the first officer's hand on the flap lever, making sure the correct selection was being made. By the time he turned back to his own instruments, the situation had changed entirely. While the captain had been looking at the flap selector and at the first officer's hands, the nose of the aircraft had continued the gentle downward pitch that began when he reduced thrust, and it had kept going. The Boeing was no longer climbing, it was descending. And because of the high airspeed the captain had been worried about, the descent was accelerating fast. The rate on the vertical speed indicator had passed 8,000 feet per minute. The aircraft was falling out of the sky at over 6 times the rate at which it had been climbing only seconds before. The ground proximity warning system, designed to alert pilots when the aircraft is approaching terrain or water that should not be in its flight path, began to sound. The first officer, registering the alarm and the changing pitch, asked the captain what was happening. The captain, still focused on the flap settings, did not immediately respond, and instead asked for flaps 1, the next stage of the cleanup procedure. The response he might have given on any ordinary climb. In the cabin behind them, the passengers were experiencing the dive directly. They could not see the airspeed indicator or the vertical speed display, but they could feel the floor falling away beneath them. And they could see, through the windows, the cloud layer disappearing upward and the surface of the Pacific Ocean rising into view ahead of them. Several were thrown forward against their seatbelts. Unsecured items in the cabin lifted briefly into the air. A number of passengers would later describe seeing nothing but water filling the window glass and being convinced, in that moment, that the aircraft was about to crash into the sea. Some of them screamed. Some of them prayed silently. None of them, for the duration of those seconds, expected to live. In the cockpit, the captain finally looked back at his primary flight display. The artificial horizon was nowhere near where it should have been. He pulled back on the control column, hard, and pushed the throttles forward to maximum thrust, the standard escape maneuver for an aircraft approaching terrain unintentionally. The nose came up. The descent slowed, stopped, and reversed. At the lowest point of the recovery, the aircraft was 748 feet above the surface of the Pacific Ocean. The recovery itself was almost as violent as the descent had been. The aircraft pitched upward to more than 23 degrees nose high, climbed at a vertical rate of over 8,600 feet per minute, almost identical in magnitude to the descent rate it had just reversed. And the forces on the airframe and its occupants reached 2 66/100ths times the standard force of gravity. The ground proximity warning fell silent. The aircraft was climbing again. From the moment the captain had looked away from his primary flight display to check the flap setting, until the lowest point of the dive over the Pacific, approximately 10 seconds had passed. Once the aircraft was on a stable climb, the captain made an announcement over the cabin address system, reassuring the passengers that everything was now under control. He contacted the lead cabin attendant by interphone, asking after the condition of the passengers and the cabin. The report came back that no one was injured, that no internal damage was visible, and that the aircraft itself appeared to be intact. The captain weighed the options. Returning to Kahului in the worsening weather, with the possibility of further wind shear, was not necessarily safer than continuing. He decided to press on to San Francisco. The remaining 5 hours of the flight were uneventful. The aircraft landed at San Francisco International Airport 27 minutes ahead of schedule. The captain filed an internal incident report through the airline's own safety reporting channels, as required by company procedure. Because no one had been hurt and no damage had been sustained, the event did not, by the criteria of federal regulation, meet the threshold for mandatory notification of the National Transportation Safety Board. United did not separately make a voluntary report. For the next 2 months, no one outside the airline knew that anything had occurred. The aircraft returned to service, completed dozens of further flights, and the cockpit voice recorder continued to record over its own oldest data on every one of them, gradually erasing the audio of the dive and the captain's voice in the seconds during which he had stopped flying the aircraft, and the first officer's voice in the seconds during which he had set the wrong number on the flap lever. The internal report submitted by the captain at San Francisco sat in United safety files, unseen by anyone with subpoena authority. No one, beyond a small number of company personnel, had any reason to know that an aircraft full of passengers had come, for 10 seconds in the rain off Maui, to within 700 feet of the Pacific Ocean. The story emerged in February of 2023, when an aviation journalist at the publication The Air Current cross-referenced public flight tracking data with a private tip and identified the unusual altitude profile of Flight 1722 on the afternoon of the 18th of December. He published an analysis showing the climb, the dive, and the recovery, derived from second-by-second position data automatically broadcast by the aircraft itself. The article triggered an immediate response from the safety board, which opened its own investigation 2 days later, on the 14th of February, 8 weeks after the event itself. By that time, the cockpit voice recorder and the flight data recorder on the aircraft had long since overwritten themselves. Both devices retain only a finite duration of data, and unless the aircraft is physically grounded immediately after an incident, the recordings of the event are lost. Investigators were forced to work with what the airline had voluntarily preserved: selected flight data, the crew's own written accounts, the maintenance records, rather than the rich primary data they would normally have had at their disposal. The final report, published by the Safety Board in August of 2023, traced the cause to 2 separate but linked failures. The first was the miscommunication on the flap setting, the captain calling for 5, the first officer hearing 15, in conditions of heavy turbulence and inside a cockpit already absorbing weather radar warnings and wind shear advisories. The second was the captain's loss of vertical flight path awareness in the seconds that followed. While he had been looking at the flap selector and the first officer's hands, he had stopped flying the aircraft. The autopilot had not been engaged at that phase of flight. There was no electronic safety net catching the descent. The Boeing was being hand-flown, and the hand on the column had momentarily forgotten what it was doing. The board's conclusion was, by its own standards, blunt. The probable cause of the incident was the flight crew's failure to manage the airplane's vertical flight path, airspeed, and pitch attitude following a miscommunication about the captain's desired flap setting during the initial climb. United Airlines responded in the months that followed by revising its training modules to emphasize the importance of clear flap setting callouts in turbulence, and by running an awareness campaign at its training center on the management of vertical flight path during the initial climb. That awareness campaign was, in the end, the practical legacy of an afternoon on the 18th of December 2022. An afternoon on which 281 people had come within 748 feet of the surface of the Pacific Ocean, had said one of them 5, and the other had heard the word 15.